The descent onto Ythar 9 was anything but smooth. The research vessel Orion Dawn shuddered violently as it entered the thin, icy atmosphere of the moon, its reinforced hull groaning against the sudden shift in pressure. The storm outside was unlike anything the crew had encountered before. Sheets of frozen particles crashed against the ship, creating a deafening roar that filled the cockpit. The pilot, an experienced navigator from the Thalary species named Vicar, clenched his jaw as he struggled to maintain control. "We're losing stabilizers," he growled, his elongated fingers flying over the controls in a desperate attempt to keep the ship from spiraling. Randy Lewis, the only human on the mission, was strapped into his seat near the observation window, his eyes scanning the white void beyond the reinforced glass. His breathing remained steady despite the chaos around him. Years of experience in extreme survival conditions had conditioned him to remain calm even when facing the unknown. "Brace for impact," Vakar barked as the ship gave a final lurch, slamming into the frozen ground with a force that knocked out the lights for several seconds. The emergency systems kicked in, flooding the cabin with a dim red glow. Silence followed. Then, a sharp hiss as the ship's hull settled into the ice. Lewis unstrapped himself and moved quickly to the control panel, glancing at the temperature readings. The outside temperature was brutally low, well below the survivable threshold for most species present on the team. The internal systems were still functioning, but the sudden crash had taken a toll on the ship's integrity. The engines were down, and a quick systems check confirmed what Lewis had feared. Communications were fried. "We're stranded," muttered Kalis, a scientist from the Xiphos race. His translucent skin shimmered under the emergency lights, betraying the subtle tremor that ran through his body. His species, like most others aboard, was not built for extreme cold. Lewis glanced at the others. There were 6 members in total, each from different parts of the galaxy. They had been selected for this mission due to their expertise in planetary analysis, but none of them had anticipated the brutal conditions they now faced. Their survival depended on quick thinking and adaptation, 2 things Lewis had spent his entire life mastering. Vicar cursed under his breath as he examined the ship's external diagnostics. "Our energy cores are already draining faster than expected. This storm is pulling heat from the vessel. If we don't act fast, we won't last more than a few hours." Lewis walked toward the exit hatch and activated the external scanners. The screen displayed a vast, endless expanse of ice stretching in all directions. The storm outside howled mercilessly, sending gusts of frozen air that could strip flesh from bone. "We can't stay in the ship," Lewis said finally. His voice was calm but firm. "The hull will lose heat faster than we can compensate. We need to move." Kalis turned to him, his large, glassy eyes filled with disbelief. "Move? Where exactly?" "There's nothing out there but ice and death." Lewis didn't respond immediately. Instead, he adjusted his thermal suit and reached for his pack. He had spent time on Earth's most unforgiving terrains. Antarctica, the Siberian tundra, the frozen wastelands of Mars's northern hemisphere. Cold was an enemy he knew well. More importantly, he knew how to fight it. "There's geothermal activity in the region," he said at last. The pre-mission scans showed underground heat pockets. "If we can find a fissure, we can use it to keep warm." Vakar exhaled sharply, considering the plan. "You want us to go out there? In this?" He motioned toward the furious storm outside. "You might be able to handle the cold, human, but the rest of us will die before we get 10 steps from the ship." Lewis knelt near the emergency supply storage, pulling out survival gear. He handed each crew member additional thermal layers, though he knew they wouldn't be enough on their own. He needed something better. He thought fast. The ship's emergency rations included chemical heat packs, but they were designed for minor cold exposure, not this level of frostbite-inducing temperatures. He needed insulation. The answer came as he looked at the ship's damaged panels. He grabbed a cutting tool and got to work. The others watched as he cut strips of the ship's interior padding. Heat-resistant insulation meant to protect against temperature fluctuations in deep space. He layered them against their suits, securing them with adhesive patches. "This will buy us time," he explained as he worked. Not much, but enough to move. Kalis hesitated, but seeing no other option, he let Lewis secure the additional insulation around his arms. One by one, the rest of the crew followed suit. The storm outside showed no signs of stopping, but waiting would only mean freezing to death inside a dying ship. Lewis stood at the hatch, securing his gear. We find a fissure, we build a shelter, and we make it through the night. The aliens exchanged glances, uncertainty flickering across their faces. Then, one by one, they nodded. Vikar, still skeptical, sighed. "You'd better know what you're doing, human." Lewis smirked. "I usually do." With that, he activated the hatch release. The door hissed open, and an instant wave of brutal cold surged inside. The storm roared in their ears as Lewis stepped out first, leading the way into the frozen wasteland beyond. The storm howled across the frozen wasteland, a relentless force that clawed at exposed surfaces and threatened to strip away the fragile warmth clinging to the expedition team. Lewis moved ahead, his boots crunching through the thick ice, his breath crystallizing in the frigid air. The wind cut through even the reinforced insulation of his suit, but he ignored the discomfort, keeping his focus on the terrain. He had spent years enduring extreme environments, and he knew that survival required not just endurance, but strategy. Behind them, the rest of the crew struggled to keep pace. Baker walked stiffly, his normally fluid movements hindered by the heavy padding hastily secured around his suit. He muttered curses in his native language, his breath fogging up the inside of his visor. Kalis stumbled for the third time, his hands shaking as he tried to brace himself against the wind. His translucent skin had taken on a pale, bluish tint, a dangerous sign. Lewis paused, turning back to assess the group. The cold was already taking a toll, and they had barely made it 100 yards from the wrecked ship. He knew that if he pushed them too hard, they would collapse before reaching any form of shelter. He had to adjust his plan. He scanned the landscape, his eyes narrowing as he spotted a cluster of jagged ice formations up ahead. The pre-mission scans had indicated possible geothermal activity, but there had been no confirmation of surface fissures. If there was any natural heat source nearby, it would likely be in the form of an underground vent, and those ice spires could indicate structural weaknesses in the terrain. Lewis motioned for the others to follow as he changed course, pushing toward the formations. Every step was a battle against the storm, the wind threatening to knock them off balance. He clenched his jaw, forcing his muscles to move despite the stiffness creeping into his limbs. The others had it worse. Kalis could barely stay upright, and Vecker's movements had become sluggish. When they reached the ice formations, Lewis pressed a gloved hand against the surface, feeling for any trace of warmth. At first there was nothing, only the dead chill of the frozen wasteland. Then, as he moved further around the spire, he felt a subtle shift, a faint rise in temperature, barely perceptible through his thick gloves. "Here," he said, his voice hoarse from the cold. "This is it." Vikar leaned against the ice, exhaling sharply. "I don't feel anything." "You wouldn't," Lewis replied. "It's minimal, but it's there. Underground heat." Kalis shivered violently. "How does that help us?" Lewis pulled a small scanning device from his pack and activated it. The screen flickered, struggling against the interference from the storm, but after a few moments, it confirmed what he suspected. There was a deep fissure beneath them, radiating a small but steady source of heat. The problem was getting to it. He circled the formation, looking for an access point. If there was an opening large enough to crawl through, they could use it as temporary shelter. But the ice was thick, solid, and showed no visible cracks. If they wanted inside, they would have to make their own way in. Lewis pulled out his cutting tool, activating the heated blade. "We dig," Vecker groaned. "You're insane." "Maybe," Lewis admitted, "but unless you have a better idea, start cutting." Vagar hesitated, then pulled out his own tool. Kalis was too weak to help, so Lewis told him to conserve his energy. The two of them worked in silence, carving away at the ice as quickly as possible. Every second counted. The ice was denser than Lewis anticipated, but he didn't let it slow him down. He cut in a methodical pattern, creating an angled entrance that would provide some protection from the wind. The deeper they went, the more he felt the subtle shift in temperature. After what felt like an eternity, the blade of his tool broke through into open space. A rush of slightly warmer air escaped through the gap, carrying the faint scent of minerals. "We're in," Lewis said. He widened the opening enough for the others to crawl through, then climbed in first. The interior was a natural cavern, its walls slick with condensation. It wasn't warm by any stretch, but compared to the brutal cold outside, it was survivable. He turned back, helping Kalis inside, then Vakar. The moment they were in, he pulled a thermal sheet from his pack and secured it over the entrance, blocking most of the wind. Kalis collapsed against the cavern wall, his body trembling violently. "I can't feel my hands." Lewis acted fast. He pulled out emergency heat packs, cracking them open and pressing them against Kalis's hands and chest. The alien flinched at the sudden warmth, but Lewis knew it was the only way to keep circulation going. Vakar slumped down, his breathing heavy. "We're alive. I don't know how, but we're alive." Lewis allowed himself a moment to breathe. The shelter was temporary, but it bought them time. Time to recover, time to think. But they weren't out of danger yet, not even close. The cavern walls glistened with condensation, faint rivulets of moisture trickling down the mineral-rich ice. The air was still cold, but the oppressive, biting wind had been left outside. Lewis exhaled, watching his breath swirl in the dim light of his wrist display. The heat signature in this underground space was weak, but it was there, and that meant they had a chance. He turned toward Kalis, who remained curled against the cavern wall, his body trembling violently. The heat packs Lewis had applied were working, but the alien system was still struggling to compensate for the extreme exposure he had endured. If they didn't get proper warmth soon, he wouldn't make it through the night. Vakar sat a few feet away, his back resting against a smooth section of ice. He was breathing heavily, his normally sharp eyes dull with exhaustion. His species could endure colder temperatures than Kalis, but even he was reaching his limit. Lewis could see the way his hands shook slightly as he adjusted the settings on his suit, trying to optimize its remaining power. The ship's energy reserves were gone. Whatever they did now, they had to do it with what they had in their packs and whatever the planet itself could provide. Lewis knelt near the center of the cavern, pressing his gloved palm against the icy floor. Beneath them, geothermal heat was slowly radiating upward, not enough to make the space comfortable, but enough to suggest they were near a more substantial heat source. If there was a deeper cavern below, one with active geothermal vents, they could tap into that warmth and create a survivable shelter. The question was how to reach it without destabilizing the structure they were already in. He stood and activated his scanner, adjusting the settings to detect thermal fluctuations. The readings were weak, flickering as the device struggled against the residual interference from the storm outside. But after a few moments, he found what he was looking for. A faint signature directly beneath them, suggesting a hollow space deeper in the ice. If they could reach it, they might find the warmth they so desperately needed. "We need to go deeper," Lewis said. Vakar groaned, running a hand down his face. "You're joking." Lewis shook his head. "There's a larger heat source below us. If we stay here, we'll freeze within hours. If we reach that pocket, we stand a chance." Kalis shifted, his eyes glassy but focused. "How do we get down?" Lewis considered their options. The cavern walls were too thick to simply carve through without destabilizing the structure. A slow, careful descent was the only viable solution. He reached for his gear, pulling out a length of reinforced climbing rope and an anchor spike. "We lower ourselves," he said, "one at a time." Vakar scoffed. "Through what? I don't see a tunnel." Lewis ignored him and moved to the center of the cavern, where the ice looked thinner. He activated his cutting tool and began carving a precise, circular section. The ice resisted at first, but as he worked, cracks formed along the edges. A final cut, and the slab gave way, revealing a dark void beneath. A wave of warmer air rushed upward, carrying the sharp scent of minerals and damp stone. "There's our way down," Lewis said. Kalis shuddered. "That doesn't look stable." "It's not," Lewis admitted, "but it's our only option." He secured the anchor spike to a sturdy section of ice and attached the rope. Then, without hesitation, he looped it around his waist and began his descent. The rope creaked under his weight as he lowered himself into the darkness, his wrist light illuminating the icy walls. The deeper he went, the warmer the air became. By the time his boots touched solid ground, he could feel a distinct difference in temperature. It wasn't enough to be comfortable, but it was survivable. He looked around. The lower cavern was wider than he expected, its walls rougher, composed of a mixture of ice and stone. Small pockets of steam hissed from cracks in the rock, evidence of geothermal activity. It wasn't an oasis, but it was something they could work with. "Clear?" he called up. Vakar muttered something under his breath but grabbed the rope and followed. His descent was slower, more cautious, but he landed without incident. Lewis steadied him as he unclipped the rope. Kalis was the last. He hesitated at the edge, his movements sluggish. Lewis frowned. The alien was weaker than he had let on. His species wasn't designed for extreme cold, and despite the temporary relief, his body was still shutting down. Lewis turned to Veker. "We need to lower him manually." Vakar scowled but nodded. Together they secured the rope around Kalis and carefully lowered him. The moment his feet touched the ground, Lewis pulled him into a sitting position, pressing another heat pack against his chest. "Stay awake," Lewis ordered. Kalis blinked sluggishly, but nodded. Now that they were down, they had to make the space livable. Lewis moved quickly, pulling out the emergency thermal blankets from his pack and securing them against the cavern walls to trap the heat. Then he gathered loose stones, forming a small makeshift barrier around one of the steam vents to direct the warmth outward. It was crude, but it would work. Vakar watched him, arms crossed. "You've done this before." "Not exactly like this," Lewis admitted, "but close enough." Vakar exhaled, shaking his head. "Humans. Always surviving the impossible." Lewis didn't respond. He was focused on Kalis, who was still shivering but looked more alert than before. That was a good sign. If they could stabilize him, he might make it through the night. Lewis sat back, rolling his shoulders. They had shelter, heat, and a chance. It wasn't much, but it was enough, for now. The warmth radiating from the steam vents had begun to make a difference. The cavern, though still far from comfortable, no longer felt like a death sentence. Lewis sat with his back against the stone, his mind racing through the next steps. They had shelter and a source of heat, but survival was still precarious. Their food rations were limited, and their thermal suits were running on reserve power. Without a long-term solution, they wouldn't last more than a few days. Kalis stirred weakly, his glassy eyes focusing on the flickering light from Lewis's wrist display. His breathing was steadier now, though his body still trembled at intervals. Lewis handed him another heat pack, pressing it firmly against his chest before adjusting the layers of insulation wrapped around his arms. "Stay awake," Lewis said, his voice firm but not unkind. Kalis blinked slowly. Still cold. Lewis turned to Vakar, who was pacing near the cavern entrance, his sharp eyes scanning their surroundings. "We need more heat. This isn't enough to fully stabilize him." Vakar exhaled through his nose, his breath visible in the air. "You think I don't know that? We've barely had a moment to breathe, and now you want us to dig deeper?" Lewis didn't rise to the bait. He understood the frustration. The situation was exhausting, and the instinct to rest was overwhelming. But rest without security was just another step toward death. "We need a proper heat source," Lewis said, "one that won't disappear if the vents shift." Vakar crossed his arms. "And how do you suggest we do that, human?" Lewis ignored the comment and retrieved his scanner. The device was still struggling to get clear readings, but he adjusted the parameters, filtering out the residual static from the storm above. If there was a stronger heat source nearby, he needed to find it now. A few moments passed before the scanner gave a faint but promising signal. Another thermal pocket, slightly deeper than their current position. Lewis studied the data carefully. If the readings were accurate, this chamber was closer to an active geothermal fissure. That meant more consistent heat and possibly even access to liquid water. "There's another chamber below us," Lewis said. "More heat, maybe even water." Vaker scoffed. "You really do love sending us into holes in the ground." Lewis met his gaze. "You want to freeze, or do you want to live?" The car's jaw tightened, but after a long pause, he gave a sharp nod. "Fine. But if this collapses on us, I'll kill you before the ice does." Lewis smirked. He pulled out his cutting tool and got to work. This time, he had to be more careful. The cavern they were in was already structurally weak, and cutting too aggressively could cause a collapse. He carved slowly, chipping away at the ice in controlled sections. The deeper he went, the stronger the warmth became. That was a good sign. Vacar stood behind him, watching with wary interest. He had stopped arguing, which Lewis took as progress. The alien might not trust him fully, but at least he was willing to follow his lead. After an hour of work, the ice gave way, revealing a narrow tunnel leading downward. A wave of warmer air rushed past them, carrying the unmistakable scent of minerals and damp rock. Lewis tested the stability of the entrance before securing the rope. "I'll go first," he said. Vacar raised an eyebrow. "Of course you will." Lewis didn't waste time. He lowered himself into the tunnel, his boots scraping against the walls as he descended. The passage was tight, but it widened as he neared the bottom. When he landed, he immediately noticed the difference. The air was significantly warmer, and the ground beneath him was damp. He scanned the area with his wrist light, revealing a shallow pool of water at the far end of the chamber. Water. He exhaled sharply, relief washing over him. It wasn't much, but it meant they had a resource they could use. Hydration was no longer a concern, and if the heat was stable, they could build a livable shelter. He looked up. "It's good, come down." Vacar followed, grumbling the entire way. When he landed, his expression shifted as he took in the surroundings. "I'll be damned," Lewis smirked. "Told you." They secured Kalis last, lowering him slowly to avoid any strain. When he reached the ground, Lewis guided him toward the warmest section of the chamber. The alien sighed weakly, his body relaxing for the first time in hours. Lewis stepped back, taking in their new refuge. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. For now, they had won another battle. The war for survival, however, was far from over. Lewis stood in the warmth of the lower cavern, watching as Kalis finally stopped shivering. The alien had curled into the warmest corner, his breathing steadier, his translucent skin losing some of its dangerously pale hue. The geothermal heat had done its job. They had found safety, at least for now. Lewis turned toward the small pool at the far end of the chamber, kneeling beside it. He dipped a gloved hand into the water, feeling its tepid temperature. It wasn't hot, but it wasn't frozen either. That meant it was stable. If they rationed properly, it would last them as long as they needed. Vaker crouched beside him, scooping up a handful of water and letting it trickle between his fingers. "We've done worse," he admitted grudgingly. Lewis smirked. "Yeah, but this time we're ahead of the game." Vacar exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You really don't know when to quit." "I don't have that luxury." Lewis stood, stretching his stiff muscles. The hours of digging and cutting had taken their toll, but now they had shelter, warmth, and water. That meant their next focus was food. He checked his pack, pulling out the remaining rations. There wasn't much, just a few compressed nutrient bars designed for emergencies, enough to last them another 2, maybe 3 days at best. That wouldn't be enough to sustain them indefinitely. Vaker must have been thinking the same thing. "We can't survive on this alone." "No," Lewis agreed. "But if there's microbial life down here, there could be more." Vacar frowned. "You think something actually lives in this ice?" Lewis nodded toward the water. "We already know bacteria are present. That means nutrients exist in some form. If there's anything larger, algae, fungi, or even microscopic organisms, we can find a way to convert it into food." Vacar didn't look convinced, but he didn't argue. "How do we find out?" Lewis pulled out his scanner, calibrating it for organic matter. He swept it over the water, waiting as the device processed the data. The results came back after a few moments, displaying a faint but promising signature. "There's something here," Lewis said. "Not large, but it's alive." Vakar leaned in, studying the readout. "Edible, maybe. We need to test it first." Lewis pulled out a collection vial, scooping a sample from the pool. He set up a small containment unit from his survival kit, running it through basic filtration and heat treatment. If the sample contained anything harmful, the process would neutralize it. He watched the device intently. Minutes passed before the scanner beeped softly, displaying the final result. "Safe," Lewis confirmed. Vakar grunted. "If this kills us, I'm haunting you." Lewis smirked but took the first bite. The processed material was bland, nearly tasteless, but it didn't make him sick. That was all that mattered. Vakar followed suit, chewing slowly before shrugging. "Could be worse." Lewis turned toward Kalis, offering him a portion. The alien hesitated before accepting it. His movements were still sluggish, but he was improving. That was a good sign. With water and a potential food source secured, they had what they needed to last. Not comfortably, but long enough. Lewis leaned against the cavern wall, letting himself breathe for the first time in what felt like hours. His mind was already working on the next step, signaling for rescue, finding a way back to the surface, but for now, survival had been won. Vakar sat beside him, crossing his arms. "You really don't stop thinking, do you?" Lewis smirked. "Not if I can help it." Vakar exhaled, his gaze drifting to the ceiling. "You think anyone's looking for us?" Lewis's expression hardened slightly. "They will be." Vakar didn't look convinced, but he didn't argue. He had seen firsthand what Lewis could do. Silence settled between them. Not the uneasy silence of fear, but the quiet certainty that they had made it. For now, the worst had passed. The storm above might rage on, but deep within the ice, life had found a way. And that was enough.